Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Wednesday. It is July 20th, and we will hear the presentation, Building a National Zoning Atlas, Scaling Transparency and Consistency. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to help you with those technical questions. For your questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the questions box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during our designated Q&A time. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Technology Division of APA. You'll hear a little bit more about them in just a moment, but wanted to acknowledge that the Technology Division was here to put together today's session. We thank you. Next on your screen is, it's our last webcast for July. We are actually booking into the middle of fall now. So you can head over to our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planning-webcast, to register for all of our upcoming sessions. Our session coming up here on Friday, it's a biggie. It's our ethics session. This will be available for you to view afterwards, of course, and it will also be, this ethics session will be on demand as well. But we do encourage you to attend live because this is actually really fun and interactive, and you'll want to be there. So if you need your ethics credits or you're just interested, be sure to sign up for this session. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits for live viewing, and you can record your credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found again on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I also post when new sessions are available for you to register for. And I also send weekly reminders of what's on tap for the week. We record all of our sessions and post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel so that you will be notified when a new session is available for you to view. If you do head over there, you will notice that we have well over 400 recordings, all available to view for free. So again, if you have any questions for our panelists today, just type those in your questions box and we'll get to those at the end. I am now going to verbally turn it over to Lee, who is going to kick things off. And we are going to have two polling questions here. Lee, do you want me to do those now, or are you going to integrate them in? You just let me know.
Yeah, I'll give you a cue.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Christine, and thank you all for joining the webinar this afternoon with APA Ohio and the American Planning Association's Technology Division. My name is Leon Plass, I go by Lee, and I'm a senior manager at the Urban Land Institute, serving as secretary of the Technology Division. I'm honored to introduce our presenter for this session, Sarah Bronin, director of the National Zoning Atlas Research Collaborative and professor at Cornell Law School, for the session, Building a National Zoning Atlas, Scaling Transparency and Consistency. But before we dive into this presentation, I'd love to learn a little bit more about who's joined us today. So if you can, please take a moment to share a little bit about yourself. Here's the cue. And tell me who you are, what sector you operate in.
Okay, I went ahead, I just launched that poll. It's heading out now, so let us know. Are you public, private, academic, nonprofit? If you're kind of not in any of them, you can always put an answer in your chat box. We'll give it a few seconds here. My panelists, unfortunately, you are unable to participate in the poll. So if you don't see it on your screen to my panelists, it's okay. I'll give it another second here, and then I'll share our results so we can all see who's on the line today. Let's see here. right, I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm just going to share these results.
All right.
Wonderful. So you can see 60% public, 30% private, 3% academic, 6% nonprofit. So that's what we have on the line today.
And I have a second question for you guys. If you can, just quickly type in the chat. Tell me one thing you'd like to learn or know a little bit more about in the realm of zoning and land use policy. And bonus points for questions that are related to emergent technology-based solutions to planning problems in that sphere.
Okay, it looks like we're getting some responses in. Automating, digitizing paper zoning maps, figuring out density of parcels, nationwide API, ways to compare zoning between jurisdictions, communication methods, accessory housing best practices, trends in zoning, making code and maps more user-friendly. Oh, these are good. The people have come with questions, Sarah. They are ready to go. Will we ever get away from a paper permit? Actually, I have a really good webcast for you all regarding that, and I will put a link to it. If you're interested in an alternative to paper permitting, we actually recently had a webcast on online permitting. So I'm going to put that in the chat box. But anyway, so we've got a lot of great folks are ready to go.
Wonderful. So we are actually going to get started in just a moment, but in the meantime, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the APA's technology division. So the technology division is made up of planners, technologists, and other APA division members interested in how technology can assist in the planning, design, and decision-making processes to create new opportunities to enhance public involvement, share information, and make more informed decisions in cities and towns throughout the country. You can learn more about the APA Technology Division by visiting tech.planning.org or reaching out to me or my colleague, David Wasserman. On the subject of this presentation, most people, I don't think, associate zoning with innovation or new technology. And in the context of planning in the US, zoning has a history, one that's not all good and in many cases not at all equitable. Even today, it can be incredibly difficult to locate and interpret maps and policies, and that has some serious implications for historically marginalized groups and development outcomes in communities more broadly. Today, we're finding ways to leverage digital resources and professional networks to communicate local zoning in ways that lay people can access and understand. Today's presentation is centered on one such effort towards this critical and laudable goal. Now, without further ado, I am going to turn the virtual mic over to Professor Bronin for her presentation. Again, Building a National Zoning Atlas, Scaling Transparency and Consistency, centered on her groundbreaking work towards bridging this long-standing accessibility gap, as well as on the role that planners play in this effort. There will be opportunities for questions towards the end of the session, so please make liberal use of the chat and/or the Q&A functions. Take it away.
Great. Lee, thank you so much for that introduction, and I hope you can see my screen. I can't see you anymore, but if you're there, could you let me know?
We can see your screen. Did you put it into presentation mode? It might just be lagging.
Yes. Okay.
I'm sure it'll pop up then.
Yep. Let me just do PowerPoint slideshow. Does that look better?
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Bronin. I'm a professor at Cornell at the School of Architecture, Art, and Planning, as well as the law school. And over the last couple months have started up this project based on a project in Connecticut I'll talk a little bit about called the National Zoning Atlas. But before we get to that, I just wanted to frame the issue in I guess, to our audience today. I think most of you are professional planners. We're at the APA, of course. And so I think for planners, everybody from planning staff to planning commissioners to elected officials want people, ordinary people, to be more involved in the planning process and more aware of the impact that land use decisions and land use rules have on their lives. But the reality is that most people don't understand how to get involved. They don't understand what the rules say, and they don't understand really necessarily how everything works together. And so even though we all want for more people to engage in planning and zoning conversations, the truth is that we haven't always given them the tools to successfully do that. And there are lots of exceptions, of course, but I think this is generally true. If you look at zoning codes, and that's what we're talking about today, that aspect of planning, really just the rules of the game, the zoning rules, you see that they are all over the map. So here are just cover pages and tables of contents from zoning codes around Connecticut. They all look different. They're all formatted differently. The table of contents are different. The ways that they describe zoning districts are different. And if you've seen one zoning code, you certainly have not seen them all. They're just hardly, even for planners, possible to compare one to the other easily. Now you could sift through the hundreds of pages in each of the zoning codes and work it out, especially you as professionals, but the average citizen, there's no way that they can compare a Hartford to a Sherman to a Ledyard to a Canterbury to Canton and so on. Similarly, the zoning maps that we've all seen can be really complicated. So here's the zoning map of Stamford. You have dozens of districts in this map. You have different colors. You have check marks. You have districts that start with R's, district that starts with RMs. This is districts that start with C's. If you're a non-planner, non-expert, or even if you are an expert, and no knock on Stamford, by the way, great city, but it's really hard to understand visually how all of these districts fit together and what it is that they're trying to achieve together for the good of the city. So with that in mind, and again, these are things that you already know because you're experts, but with that just framing in mind, I think we can all agree, or should agree, that standardized information can help people understand zoning, which of course is a building block to the planning profession and the endeavor of planning generally. Standardized information about zoning can also help planners compare jurisdictions. So one of the questions that we just got in the chat was about comparing jurisdictions. And that is almost impossible to do now with the current tools that we have available, which are really just the text and maps of the zoning codes themselves. So that brings me to the project that I hope at a very baseline level can help us address those issues. And it is the National Zoning Atlas Project. So the dark blue states that you're seeing on this map are the 10 states where we have what we would call official statewide zoning atlas initiatives underway. They range from California, a huge state, to Rhode Island and Hawaii, of course, two smaller states, states in the West like Montana, and of course, lots of states in the East. And there's a whole chunk of them right here in and around Connecticut where I'm beaming in from today. If there is a lighter blue in the state, we have heard rumblings from or are working closely with teams who are interested in creating zoning maps in those states. So if you are in, well, really, if you're in one of the states that is already blue, feel free to find us. If you're in one of the states that's a tentative, feel free to find us. And if you're in one of the gray states, you can start from scratch and build a team, which is something that I'll be talking about at the very end of this conversation. But this just gives you an overview of where we have projects underway under the National Zoning Atlas umbrella. So to follow along with at least some of the stuff that I'm talking about today, I encourage you to visit zoningatlas.org. It will give you the quick links to everything that we're going to discuss today, and hopefully it will be a resource for you after this conversation. So I'll just put that in now, and I'll come back around to it towards the end again. So what is the National Zoning Atlas? It is an attempt to translate jurisdictions, local zoning jurisdictions, and to standardize the way that we view individual zoning districts, and to put all of that into an online map. To do that, we have developed a how-to guide called How to Make a Zoning Atlas, and it is for those statewide teams to use, or even for local teams, if that's what emerges over the course of the coming months, as we try to get more people to build zoning atlases and merge them into the national project. But this is online on that zoning atlas page. Just go to /how, and it's about 90 plus pages, and describes the whole process that I'm about to just briefly touch on today. So how do we make a map? So we're with the technical division here. So I thought we would start with the process by which we have created the National Zoning Atlas. So, we are in the midst of creating it. So the very first thing that we do when we come to a state project is we generate a list of jurisdictions. Now, as you know, depending on what state you're in, not every jurisdiction has zoning. Connecticut, where I'm from, has 180 zoning jurisdictions. I call them zoning jurisdictions. 2 of them say they don't have zoning, but they have subdivision rules that function as zoning, so we folded them into the Connecticut map. But in your state or in your region, you may not actually have a good handle on how many jurisdictions have zoning. This has proven to be somewhat time-consuming task in places where this question has never been asked, or it has not been publicly made available. And so upstate New York, where my lab at Cornell has been working on an atlas, did spend a little bit of time trying to figure out who has zoning and who doesn't, especially among the smaller and rural towns. All right, so first you got to figure out who has zoning. Then you have to collect information about the jurisdictions. And that includes collecting 3 pieces of information: the zoning code, the text of it, the zoning map, so the officially adopted zoning map, and if the third piece, if the jurisdiction has it available, the zoning shapefiles, so the geospatial information. Not all jurisdictions have all 3. Certainly the one that's missing the most is the geospatial layers. But interestingly, we've also found lots of jurisdictions where we cannot find the zoning codes online, and we can't find even a copy of the official map. Now, these are typically the small jurisdictions, rural jurisdictions, where you might not even have a full-time zoning staff person, or somebody may come in part-time 1 day a week, but that's also been an effort. All right, so once you have that information, then we split off into 2 different teams when we do one of these projects. So one team is the GIS side, and so that part of the Atlas project, wherever it is, will go through the GIS layers. They will collect what they can. They will clean it. They also have to create layers for those jurisdictions that don't have GIS information. And then at the same time, on the right-hand side of your screen, you see what the code analysts are doing. So they are generating the list of districts, and they are inputting into a spreadsheet different characteristics for all of these districts. So we have the code analysts, and we have the GIS analysts, and then they come together at the end. We merge the data, and then we publish the atlas online. So what does this information look like? So we have a spreadsheet, and that is linked also from that /how page from the Zoning Atlas site. So feel free to click on that if you'd like to follow along. But there are couple of tabs on the spreadsheet. So one of the things that we ask people to do is to collect information about the different jurisdictions. So the name of the jurisdiction, is it a town or a village? The county that it's in, so we can possibly in the future aggregate information by county. We try to ask them to classify what kind of government it is. So the U.S. Census of Governments, which you're probably familiar with, classifies each local government into general purpose municipal, towns, townships, and special districts. Then we ask them to log the number of pages in the code, the number of districts. And so you can see just in this screenshot of our Westchester project, there are anywhere between 18 and 32 districts. In Connecticut, we found there are anywhere from 3 to 45, I think, districts. And then the number of pages in the zoning code varies a lot. So we had zoning codes in Connecticut, there were as little as 30 pages, and then we had up to 450 pages. And there in Westchester, it looks like we have a jurisdiction that's coming pretty close. So then we have a process for uploading codes and maps and putting them in a shared file. So that's information about the jurisdiction. Then in the spreadsheet, if you're in that tab, you can go to the next tab, which is zoning information. And here's where this is the root of the code analyst work for the Atlas. What they are doing is they are taking each and every individual district within each jurisdiction, and they are giving each district a separate row in this master spreadsheet. There are 100 categories or columns in the spreadsheet, so I'm not going to display all of them today, but this just is going to give you a sense. So what they're doing is they're putting in, so you can see, let's look at Fishkill Village in Dutchess County, also in New York State. You see the abbreviated district name and the full district name. Those appear differently on the map. You see this question whether the district is mapped. You probably have seen this before, where there is a district on the books in the text of the zoning code, but it's actually not mapped. Where we saw that most in Connecticut was in the affordable housing districts that towns had created, but never actually put on a map. So they weren't really existing. We also have found a handful of districts that are mapped, but are no longer in the text. And so that's what that next column is about. We classify them as overlays. We classify the type of zoning district. We ask if they are elderly or housing only or affordable housing only. And then we get into the different ways that single family, two family, three family, and four or more family are treated. So if you go to the how-to guide, this is a snapshot from the table of contents. So what we're really looking for here is a way to take the way that each jurisdiction classifies its district and to conform them into a set of standardized categories that can then be displayed in this national map. So in addition to what you just saw on that screen, there are 90 plus other characteristics that are logged through our methodology, and we include cataloging uses. And so how do you describe all of these? Adding in accessory dwelling units and planned residential developments. We have a methodology for cataloging lots and the way those are articulated in zoning codes. So things like minimum lot size, maximum density, setbacks, lot coverage, parking requirements, which is a big one. I'd love to talk about that. And then the structures, so that how the buildings that can be built on the site might be created. So our project is focused on housing uses. You could add in your jurisdiction additional uses, but when we're looking at cataloging structures, we are looking at housing, principal use housing, and mixed use single structures, where you have a mix of uses of housing and something else. So things like maximum height floor to area ratio, maximum number of units, and maximum number of bedrooms. So the way that the spreadsheet works with the how-to guide is you have this these columns, and then each column is tagged to, at the top, to the part of the how-to guide where it's further explained. And then there are pages and pages about how to explain it. And so through this method of combining the spreadsheet with the how-to guide, we've tried to give anybody who wants to embark on a zoning atlas project a really clear roadmap, and to try to use the guide to ensure that there's consistency across the way that people are logging their districts. So in case you were wondering, how do you get all these 10 states to do the same thing? It's through this kind of pretty regimented methodological approach. Just a note on the map collecting side and the GIS side, here's some examples of hand-drawn maps in Connecticut. The one I love most is the one on the right, which is not only hand-drawn, but also typed, and the streets are not even really outlined. So we really had to work at some of these to get them in order to include into our Connecticut map. There were also towns that clearly had done GIS mapping, as you can see in Washington, Connecticut on the left, but would not give us those layers. So we drew those too. All right, so here we're getting to that process where we're merging the two maps, the maps and the code analysis. And this is just another example from our upstate, our New York mapping project, the New York Zoning Atlas, where our zoning code, our GIS folks could tell us, okay, there's a map missing, there is a layer missing from the spreadsheet, probably a mapped but extinct layer. There is overlap, so there are things that might be called R1, but there's the layer is R1A. Is this a different district? Do we have to go back to the zoning code? So there's a lot of back and forth that goes on even after you feel like the data is collected. Reconciling the maps with the codes with the list of districts is also a time-intensive task. All right, so getting back to so that's a bit on the technical process for collecting the information. So getting back into the result, the product, we have been really excited and grateful to all of the institutions that have announced that they are working on atlases. So it includes universities like the University of Hawaii, Berkeley, Minnesota, Fordham, University of Buffalo, St. Anselm's. It also includes nonprofit organizations as well as private firms. So ZoneCo is a private planning firm out in Ohio that's leading the Ohio Zoning Atlas and is looking for partners, I'm sure. So feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch. For the New York project, just to give you a sense of how a big state works, we have a state with lots of jurisdictions, lots of potential jurisdictions. We've broken it up into counties primarily, where specific folks in Rockland County and Niagara Falls are doing those counties. We have Fordham Law School doing New York City, the Regional Plan Association working on Long Island, the University of Buffalo working in Erie County. Overarching all of New York is my lab at Cornell, who is fanned out not only in that 5-county upstate region around Ithaca, but is now fanned out to lots of other counties. You saw Dutchess and Putnam and Ulster County on those screenshots, and the New York Homes and Community Renewal Agency, which has done an awesome job in providing our team with clean geospatial layers. So I show you this because I don't know which state you're in, but just to show you an example of how a state agency, university, local partners, other universities are each taking a part. And of course, you need an overall project coordinator, and that is our lab. But you also need just the sheer manpower of trying to push this project through. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to turn to the Connecticut Project. So you've slogged through all of this data, you've collected all of these maps. What do you get out of this, and why might you really want to create this project in your own community, or what might it yield for you as planners and professionals? So Connecticut is the first state that did a zoning atlas, and ours is complete, which we're very happy about. Just to give you an idea of some just big picture, there are 169 towns in Connecticut. Unlike most states, all of Connecticut is incorporated. We thought that there would be 169 zoning jurisdictions. That makes sense, right? So each town is incorporated. But we found out when we did the map of the state, when we put it all together, that they were just blank spaces everywhere. And so if you remember back to that hand-drawn map that I said was my favorite, that is an example of a civic association to whom the state legislature had granted zoning authority. So we didn't have 169 towns. We had 11 sub-municipal entities that popped up as holes in our map that we then had to say, what even is this? And to go figure out what jurisdiction that was, usually by contacting our knowledgeable local planners. So the Branford town planner said, oh yeah, that's the civic association. Groton, a pretty small town, has 4 separate zoning authorities in it. So just a fun surprise at what we thought was the end of the project. Across all of those 180 jurisdictions, there are 2,600 zoning districts, and our team read through 32,000 pages of zoning text. Now, why did we do this project in the first place? What inspired us to do this? So in June 2020, I helped to found an organization called Desegregate Connecticut. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the thought on my mind was zoning plays a role in systemic inequality in our country, and we should do something about it. And so our project, our effort, our coalition that we built through Desegregate Connecticut really took on zoning reform in that summer of 2020. And our team included lots of different people from all over the state, but lots of young people who very eagerly saw and were willing to learn about the connections between zoning and segregation and inequality. And so we had this amazing team of people, and this was actually just our first year team. There's been a ton of people since then, volunteers, research assistants, professionals as well, who banded together to power the effort as the staff or the team behind the effort. In addition to that, we had an 80-member coalition of nonprofit organizations, ranging from housing organizations to environmental organizations, social justice groups, the APA of Connecticut, which we're very grateful for, the AIA as well, and other groups, economic development groups too. And I just show you these images to tell you why we started this process, because we went around, started talking to different communities about the importance of zoning and the need to change it on a statewide basis. And the first question we got asked often was, well, how do you know that zoning is so bad here? And so we realized that we couldn't really tell them. And that was, as a researcher and a professor, although I was an advocate, that was my advocate hat, you know, as a researcher and professor, I thought, well, surely we can figure out how to communicate this. And so that's where the Connecticut Zoning Atlas came into play. So this is an image of the atlas with nothing selected. So this is just the full state showing the primarily residential districts, the mixed with residential districts, and the non-residential districts. And you can see the dark purple is lots of Connecticut is primarily residential. The Connecticut Zoning Atlas, the way it works is you select different options. So one family housing is selected here. And then land meeting the criteria shows up, and it's in one of those shades of purple. So here we've selected one family housing, and you can see, sorry, going back, that it's a significant majority of the state. It's 91% of the state allows for single family housing. In addition to that, and so I showed you that in the spreadsheet when I just earlier in this presentation, that we show whether 1, 2, 3, or 4 family housing is permitted. The district, the atlas, I'm sorry, also shows whether accessory dwelling units are allowed, and then it has a bunch of characteristics of those accessory dwelling units. About 8 are displayed in the Connecticut Atlas, and there's others that we've collected. We also show where multifamily housing is allowed. In the map, there are half-mile radii around our train stations and Connecticut fast track stations. And I think this has been a really important one, which is the minimum lot size, which is what we've logged across every zoning district. So here you can see that a little bit blown up, 91% of land allows for single family housing as of right. And because of the way that we coded each and every individual district and matched that to geospatial layers, we can now see how many acres in Connecticut are devoted to 4 or more family housing as of right, and the total is 2%. So I think that's pretty, go back, 91 to 2%. I think that's pretty interesting information. I think it underscores why we have such differences in our communities in Connecticut. You might have the same results in your neighborhood, but the only way to figure out zoning's role in this story is to use for people to be able to see it and to understand what's happening in their communities, is to use this painstaking back-end research to then enable it to be displayed in a map. So just to show you, if you're familiar with the town of New Haven, where Yale University is located, it is, despite Yale being there, it's generally considered to be a low-income city, very diverse, much more diverse than its surrounding suburbs. And here's, I've mentioned, so New Haven is this kangaroo in the middle here, and you'll see New Haven's outline in just a minute. So here's where single family is allowed in the New Haven area. Here's where two-family housing is allowed, and in orange, that's elderly only. So it's deceiving. I just didn't turn that filter off. Here's three-family housing, and then here's 4 or more family housing as of right. So if you wonder why, some of the communities around Branford, Woodbridge, Orange, North Branford are extremely, what New Haven is somewhat impoverished from just a census data perspective, and these other communities have more wealth and are overwhelmingly white. You might again see that zoning plays, you might ask whether zoning plays some kind of role, and looking at this information, you might pick up on that. So the information in the Connecticut Atlas has been used by Desegregate Connecticut to justify a series of policy reforms. In a year and a day after we were founded, we did help the legislature through our coalition to adopt the first major statewide zoning reforms in 30 years. So if you're on this call because you're interested in reform, this is a good example of how an atlas can help you to do that. So here are just some reports that we have on desegregatect.org. So there's the economic case for zoning reform, transit-oriented communities. These are 20 to 40 page reports. So that transit-oriented communities document sets out all of the transit, that half-mile radius, and how that zoning works. We have a report on minimum lot sizes, and we had hoped that the legislature would have passed that this year, but they didn't. And then finally, we look at that large lot size question and the lack of multifamily zoning question in the environmental case for zoning reform. Again, able to pair our statistics from the Connecticut Zoning Atlas with policy reform ideas, some of which have been adopted and others of which we hope will be adopted soon. So now just extending beyond, so we've talked about what a zoning atlas can show, what kinds of policy reforms might be available depending on what your zoning atlas shows, and then just getting into other research. So this standardized information across jurisdictions, it can really help us understand which aspects of zoning codes make a difference. So we're working with Urban Institute right now, researchers Yona Freemark, Lydia Lowe, and others to understand which factors in zoning make a difference for housing affordability, for housing supply, for demographics, and so on. We also know that this information could be useful in looking at even federal initiatives to help local governments receive grant funding for doing good zoning. You can't know what good zoning is until you know, first of all, what factors matter, and second of all, how each community zones, and being able to compare that from one jurisdiction to the other. So we think that this National Zoning Atlas project can be an important tool to help statewide federal policymakers understand how to incentivize communities to change. Beyond that, of course, fair housing, we've talked about that. Transportation investments can be better understood through a National Zoning Atlas. Food supply, economic and educational opportunity, access to nature, school segregation outcomes. We know that some of these can be explained by zoning. Some of these happen at the same time as zoning. Understanding zoning can help us have better policies on all of these. Okay, so if that was not daunting to you, I hope you are still here and this might be intriguing to you enough that you might want to create your own zoning atlas. We have a page for that on the website. It's /start-here. So you can go through each of these images, and just to give you a brief synopsis, buttons rather. So if you go to the Assembling Your Team page, you will see we have some suggestions about how to do that. Most importantly, for a team, you want for people who are patient, detail-oriented, and fun, because this is a super tedious process. And unless you can laugh at the fact that district such and such only allows for one home on the 3rd story with a tower, I mean, some of these zoning codes are really funny, and you want somebody who's going to get those jokes, share them with the rest of the team, and use that as fuel to keep going in collecting this information. So that, I would say, overall, even beyond technical skills, but you also probably need some technical skills. So you need project manager, you need code analysts, you need geospatial folks. And for the project manager, it could be somebody who's very knowledgeable about zoning and planning. That's a given. But it could be a planner, a government official, it could be a lawyer, or it could be an academic researcher. So if you're any of the above and you have a good working knowledge of zoning and you can read and willing to kind of manage folks as they go through the how-to guide and the spreadsheet, you could be a great project manager. So those responsibilities, managing the team, coordinating outreach, and just being super organized, because that's what this project relies on. Under the project manager, you have that zoning code analysis side. So you probably need a team. For Connecticut, we had 20-something analysts. We did get the project done in 3 months. Shout out to the Yale College Roosevelt Institute for providing the bulk of that, but also law and graduate and undergraduate students really powered our Connecticut Atlas, and we got that done pretty smoothly. But you could also have professional planners, your colleagues, attorneys, again, really anybody who's willing to read and carefully look at the details and ask questions about how to code. So those are the people who read the zoning codes and put them into the spreadsheet. And then the GIS team, and I'll say here in Connecticut, we found that lots of people have GIS skills, but the ones that were most valuable to the project were the ones that had really strong connections in the geospatial community around the state. So they could help to convince these local towns people who had these layers to hand them over for this public good. And those responsibilities include managing, cleaning, merging the files, matching those zoning districts from the spreadsheet, and unfortunately, hand drawing missing zoning districts. Everybody's using the how-to guide, so that gets updated pretty regularly. I just submitted an update last week to SSRN. And then, so last thing, this is what our collaborative effort. So we have all these institutions, and I guess maybe dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of people who've been pitching in on these projects. And these are, I guess you would say, our values. And so if you're looking to do this for the public good, that is probably the number one. We want this to be a public resource that people can use in their own communities, that planners and decision makers, elected officials, developers, everybody, advocates can use. Of course, if you are on the team, we want you to be totally committed to data accuracy and seeing the project through to completion, because there are so many loose ends at the end. You just have to have that endurance. It's like a marathon. It's a zoning marathon. Working efficiently, being open to collaboration, and just communicating. I've really loved getting to know all of our awesome 10 state team members, and it's just been really fun. So we are in it for the public good, but we're also in it to have fun and to get something done. So all of that said, I'm putting my email here. If you have gone through this, you've read through everything, if you get a team together and you want to embark on one of the states, or you want to be added to one of the states, please email me and I'm happy to get you to the right source. It would be great if you're just an individual and you're interested in doing a project in your community to wait to email me and get situated until you have a team. Contact your local APA chapter, contact your local AIA chapter, contact local planning professors if you have a planning department in your state. Those are the people. It can't just be, it's not a one-man job, it's not a two-man job. This is lots of institutions, lots of players job with a strong central lead. So please, if you're interested in this, start working in your state, or you can ping me and say, has anybody contacted you from my state or from my region? And I'm happy to respond. But when you have a team in place, that's when we can really start cooking. Last thing, while I have a couple hundred people on this call, just to say that we have jobs available, including a project coordinator position that we'll be posting. I haven't posted the link to the actual job where you put in the materials yet, but please, if you have anybody, so zoningatlas.org/jobs, who might be interested in being a project coordinator for the national project to really help get all this incoming information in. We got a grant from Open Philanthropy, and very excited that this week we're putting this job out officially for bid. But the preview of the job description is on that jobs page. So I encourage you to pass that on to anybody who's interested in working on this, I think, super, super cool project. So with that, there's my Twitter handle. I'm going to stop showing my screen and turn it over to Lee for questions and go from there. Thanks.
Okay, hey folks, if this is Christine. If you have any questions, don't forget, just type those in that questions box and we'll get to those when we can. So our first question here is there a fear in local communities that translating and standardizing zoning codes and maps will lead to state-controlled or nationally controlled zoning policy? Once communities are better compared, it may be more obvious where there's sprawl, underutilized land, exclusionary zoning, etc., which may be targeted for change. Interesting question.
Yeah, so I mean, I can just speak to the experience that we had in Connecticut, which is that people were excited and interested in the project. We got a lot of cooperation from local planners and for the planning staff. I wouldn't say that all planning commissioners, especially in those communities that are exclusionary, so the volunteers that populate the commissions, were as excited, especially when the results were released. And we showed through the zoning map that that their community was not having an affordable housing district on paper, or having an affordable housing district that covered 2 lots was not necessarily going to show them in the best light. And that kind of embarrassment is, or a little jolt of reality is probably a good result, even though it made them uncomfortable, because it shows, okay, everybody can do better. And I think that would have been really, it was in the results where you saw a little bit of oh, okay, was that okay, that's kind of not so great. But we got a lot of cooperation. Now we're seeing that people are used, at least in the communities that we've been working with, it seems like in the other states too, people are getting used to the idea that zoning is public information. The zoning code must be made available to the public. We've had a couple of places in New York which would not give us the information. We had to go drive to it, get it. But for the most part, I'd say 99% of towns and their staff are, they know this is public, and it should be something that people can understand. That is what local governments, local governments are closest to the people they serve. People who are being served by local governments should be able to understand the laws that bind them. And if they can't, then that's a problem. And that's what this zoning atlas attempts to do. So.
Thank you. So I guess this might be sort of dependent on each state and each team, but I guess maybe in the Connecticut example, did you map any agricultural preservation zones, urban boundaries, anything like that?
So we don't have urban growth boundaries in Connecticut, like you might in Portland or maybe some other communities. So we didn't encounter that. But when we get to those states, we are having to, when we get to new things like that, we are having to try to figure out how we're going to depict those in the national map. So the only map that's online right now is Connecticut, but New York, I have a beta version of it. And so we'll be releasing that fairly shortly. And then I think these other maps will start coming online pretty quickly in the fall, at least some versions of them. The California maps are they're online through UC Berkeley, but now we're migrating those over too. So, but your question about, so it was urban growth and then agricultural preservation. So there are districts called agricultural preservation districts, and those are mapped. And then when you hover over them in the atlas, you'll be able to see, or you can see in Connecticut, you'll be able to see in the national project, the name of that district. We haven't pulled them out directly. the way we map most rural agricultural zones is because it's just residential or farming, we map those as primarily residential, and we explain why in the how-to guide.
So folks can go on and, see the Connecticut map, for example, or can folks just go on and download data? And if so, how?
So we haven't figured that out yet. So we haven't put the data out there entirely, in part because, one of the motivations for the Connecticut Project was to help ordinary people have zoning information. And there was a fear amongst at least our team, that putting out all of that back-end data with all the spreadsheet information might shift the power balance, or I guess maybe keep the power balance in a way that favors large developers, which I think some people feel like, okay, for me, I'm not scared of new housing. I think we should build. We're in a huge housing shortage. We need to maximize housing supply. But in looking at how the data is released, all of that raw data is more likely to be used by people who can already, game the system, so to speak. And so we're trying to figure out the data protocols for how we release all that back-end data, because 99% of the people who use the atlas want to see what's in the atlas and don't need the back-end data. We feel like that's an issue that we're sort of punting on for now. Some state teams are going to be releasing all of their back-end data, which is fine with us. We're just not necessarily going to do it on the national level.
Okay. There have been actually quite a few questions about that, so I hope everyone is satisfied. Everyone was kind of asking it from a different angle, but I think you got it covered here.
I will say, for the Urban Institute, they were not involved in the gathering of the data, but we have a data management agreement with them where we're sharing the data from Connecticut so that they can conduct far more sophisticated analyses than I can do on it to look at how these factors make a difference. So, if you're an academic researcher out there, it's very possible that we could collaborate. And in fact, if it's not clear from my presentation and from this kind of sprawling, no pun intended, initiative, we are all in on collaboration. So I'm happy to talk about that.
Great. A lot of questions coming in. Okay, so how do we keep it updated? What is the plan to keep all of this info current? That it's just a lot of constant work, I feel like.
Yes, and so we also, in addition to that full-time project coordinator position, we have funding to hire a database developer who's going to set out a way for us to hopefully visually, if not on the back end, log changes over time, so that somebody can look and see, okay, well, what was it in 2022, what's the zoning in 2030? Did it change? How did it change? What we found, though, was that most zoning codes don't change that often. They don't change significantly. So if you look at the vast swaths of Connecticut, you see changes probably in a couple of the suburban areas. You see rezonings. You see, actually, Hartford and Bridgeport just did total overhauls of their zoning codes. So those were big changes. But for the most part, you see just little changes here and there, and that deserves to be kept updated and needs to be. So far in the Connecticut Atlas, if anybody has a change, I get it through the Desegregate Connecticut team. They'll forward it to me, or individual planners will say, this is not updated in my town. And so, I update it. That's not feasible for the long term, but we're hoping to have a good system in place for that. And that's where this database developer is going to come in. So contact me if you know a great person for that, because right now we're looking through the IT staffing possibilities and maybe bid procurement through Cornell.
So there are a couple questions here about, and I'm not quite sure how everything is sort of laid out, but how do we tell the difference when we're looking at these maps between a community that might just have a land use map and a community that has an actual zoning code? Are we able to differentiate that?
Yeah, we only include the land use maps are not part of this project because they're not official regulatory documents. It's the zoning map, that the official zoning map is the only truth out there. You know, land use map just says what is or what could be or what we aspire to be, but the zoning map sets out the regulatory boundaries. And you know, I think there are good reasons to look at plans and to look at maps, that for aspirational maps or current land use maps, but those are, to me, the core project here is understanding the regulatory system, because that's what has to be done. And then I think future studies can look at, okay, what's the difference between the future land use map and the zoning, and why is there such a big disconnect? And I think that there's a lot of information that can come out on that for sure.
So in terms of a disconnect or a connect, what are ways in which this zoning atlas can connect to a comprehensive plan, using it as a tool, you know, for growth? How are we making that connection, particularly for just our layperson who wants to jump on and see the zoning of their community? How are we able to reflect the importance of a comprehensive plan in conjunction with your zoning code?
I think one of the values of these atlas projects is that they enable you to compare to other jurisdictions. So if your comprehensive plan calls for industrial on the edge of a town where it's the neighboring town has residential, or if you can see through these zoning maps that, wow, we don't allow residential downtown anymore, when historically that's what we used to allow. So there's, you know, bans on residential. We've seen that in some communities, and our comprehensive plan is calling for a mixed use, vibrant 24-hour downtown. Well, you know, I think it's a lot easier for people to see. Somebody has to walk through that, but I think it helps to show, if the comprehensive plan is calling for this, but the rules only allow this, it can help to highlight some mismatches.
Thank you. Are there plans, a couple of these, I'm going to combine some questions together. Are there plans for incorporating like historic preservation, special districts, land use overlays, even in your residential, your HOAs? Any plans for that, or is it a sort of state by state basis?
Yeah, so on the historic side, so let me put the historic side aside. So homeowners associations, the private rules that govern those are super complex in that they're even harder to find than zoning codes, because you have to go to the land records, you have to walk through the deeds. They're not public documents. I mean, they're public in that they're on the land records, but they're really hard to find. That would be a really great project for somebody to compare zoning with these private rules in particular jurisdictions. So I highly encourage that, but there's no way to log. Like, this project is so hard just looking at zoning codes. We're not going to add that on that, but somebody should do that. So I will throw that out into the universe. You asked about overlays. Overlays are included. Any overlay that's been created in the zoning code are included, and they're logged as overlays. And we've published the back end code for the map. In that how-to guide, there are links out to some Python script, and we have overrides for any districts that's marked as an overlay, depending on what the category, housing treatment categories are logged as. So if you're interested in that technical process, please check that out. Then on the historic front, so personally, as a professor, half of my research is in land use and zoning, and half of it is in historic preservation. I'm a historic preservationist for sure. I think that question is really important. The state of data in historic preservation is far worse than it is in zoning and land use. While we can find a good chunk of zoning districts in GIS layers, very few states, very few communities have historic districts logged. You have big cities that will log their local historic districts, but you've got local, state, and national register districts, none of which have clear protocol. The states do not map these in a good way. That said, in Connecticut, we've looked at historic districts, we've mapped those out, and we haven't published it yet, but we have an overlay as to what that zoning is. We also in Connecticut logged whether a district was specific to industrial heritage and historic preservation. We have, probably like you do in Ohio, lots of mill buildings and former industrial buildings that all should be zoned for housing. But we found that even the heritage overlay districts are not zoned for housing. They're just zoned for more industrial uses, which are not viable in this day and age. So personally, I find that topic really interesting. If there's somebody out there who's doing a zoning atlas and wants to add similar categories to Connecticut, we'd be happy to talk.
We have a couple of questions regarding regional planning commissions or regional planning agencies, bodies, whatever you call them in whatever state you're in. The first question is, how do you handle overlapping jurisdictional zoning, such as regional planning agencies and local governments, and conflicts in zoning between these agencies? Has that come up at all?
So usually there's, on a single parcel of land, there's just one zoning authority. There are situations where you might have a state agency or a regional body that has overriding authority over certain types of areas. So right here in Hartford, the state of Connecticut's Capital Region Development Authority has what is essentially zoning authority over a few blocks in downtown. So what we haven't really called out those situations in any systematic way, but in general, it's just one authority that has final zoning jurisdiction over a particular parcel. We don't see that there's shared zoning authority, because what do you do if there's a conflict? So usually the state will say, you have the authority or you have the authority, and that's what we've been coding. And that's why you saw, 11 sub-municipal jurisdictions in Connecticut. State gave these random civic associations authority or small boroughs zoning authority. But it's just the one entity that usually will have. I haven't seen a situation where two entities have jurisdiction.
Okay. The next question to that, if I can find it now, I'll find it. While I look for it, I'm going to ask an unrelated question just to keep us going here. How about a comprehensive planning atlas? Since you seem to have the zoning atlas under control, let's have a comprehensive planning atlas to show what's really going on at the ground level here.
Go for it.
Oh, you're not going to take the bite on that one?
I have 40 more states to log, not to mention the 9 states that we still have going. So I'll encourage that commentator to take that one on.
Have regional planning commissions, districts, whatever, been a resource that have been used in any states that you're aware of?
You said regional planning districts?
Or I'm assuming that this question means like regional planning commissions or agencies. That's how I'm interpreting it. I don't really know.
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, there are certainly regional planning commissions. We have one here in our area. They're advisory here.
I guess another question then, sort of off of this, as a resource for states, I know that there's a lot of like open source data that's around. How are we able to ensure that when teams are getting together to try to collect this data, that we're actually getting correct data? Is there like fact finding involved and checking involved to ensure that whatever source they're using to collect the data is current and accurate?
Yeah, that's a big part of the job. I mean, when you have the team, you're calling the office, making sure that there was what's online wasn't amended. You're, getting the GI. So, we've gotten shape files that don't match the zoning code. So we go back to the jurisdiction and say, oh yeah, well we don't have the new zoning code online, but we modified it, and then we have a whole new. It's like, what? So I mean, when we have more than one, you can, if there's one that's off, one district that's off, it's not a big deal. But when you have 5 districts or even the whole thing that's totally different, there's a problem. And that's when so at the start is when you want to be sure by calling the planners. And so in that jurisdiction, if you're on the spreadsheet, in that jurisdiction information tab, you have the column that says planner name, planner email, planner phone number. And that's the person that the team member is calling to make sure that that's the most updated zoning code or the most updated map. So even when we have done that, it's at that back end when we've merged the two, the code analysis and the maps that we've collected, that we see all of those disconnects. And then we go back, and you saw it from a slide early in the presentation, that line by line. Okay, we're seeing district R1, but it's R1A. Was there possibly new code language that was adopted and not actually included in the zoning code yet, the full PDF? It's just hanging out there as a city ordinance somewhere. So that's when you have to go back and do that again. So, and that's why I say, we're really excited for people to, do the brute force of just going through everything, but for the team to really contribute to this project, they have to be committed to going back and doing all of that data cleanup again. So actually, going back to the first question, maybe it was one of the first questions that was asked about, how do you plan to update? How do you plan to after you've done this comprehensive? It's a lot of work to just get all of this baseline done, but those incremental changes will be able to be logged hopefully a lot better after we get all of the baseline done. And it may take a few years. It's certainly going to take a few years, but that's the goal, is to really go through all of that data checking now, so we have a good clean base, and then as things happen and as things change, we can update it.
Great. So I guess what else do you see this zoning atlas being utilized for? What good things do you see coming out of this? I know one of the points is so that the everyday person who's not in the field of planning can absolutely jump online and see how their community is zoned and see how the future might play out for their community. And obviously it'd be a really cool tool for us planners. But what else do you see? Like, do you see a lot of things about housing or equity coming out of this, or like potential new land uses, or a clear route to future sprawl? Like, what do you see coming out of this?
Yeah, so the biggest, so just judging by Connecticut, we have been able to see reforms at the local and state levels that will be meaningful for equity and the environment and even economic development. So through the data that we've gathered here, we've been able to show, for example, that 80% of residential land in Connecticut has a 1 acre minimum lot size. Okay, so let that sink in. You guys are planners, you know what that means. The minimum lot size is 1 acre for 80% of land in Connecticut. So what does that do for driving? What does it do for greenhouse gases? What does it do for infrastructure costs for towns? How much farmland? We know how much farmland and forest it kills because UConn has done studies about that. So just by collecting that data, we now have a talking point, a clear talking point for the environmental community to use, for the affordable housing community to use, that says, this is absolutely crazy. And I think, I hate to say that the result of the atlas is that we're going to see across the country all of these absolutely crazy statistics that will have to force us to change. But I do think that is going to be a result. And we also see in this atlas that multifamily housing is made extremely difficult to build. And so you've seen lots of conversations about this, op-eds and podcasts, and about the fact that our housing supply is exclusively detached, large lot, single family housing with a very small amount of multifamily housing mixed in. And for the climate, for affordability, for equity, we have to change that. We cannot build these giant 1 acre homes on 1 acre lots. I live in a townhouse that is on a 0.1 acre lot in downtown Hartford on a park. You know, it's just that I'm not saying everybody has to live that way, but we need to give more people that option. Before we overhauled the zoning code in Hartford, we couldn't build these kinds of townhouses again in this area. So so as a chair of the city's planning commission and zoning commission here for 7 years, and we overhauled the zoning code, which I'm really proud of, and also happy to talk about some with anybody who has local rezoning ambitions. But we don't realize how bad it is now. And so I think that, you know, hopefully a product of the Atlas will be to expose these crazy things that we do to ourselves, and then have different people take up those facts and figures for their own purposes to then lead to reform.
Great. So how are we showing like form-based code zoning versus like traditional zoning? How are we showing the differences on like a map where, you know, one community might have like regular Euclidean zoning and then the next one has form-based codes? How do we do that?
So this is an interesting question, and we're actually working with the Form-Based Codes Institute from Smart Growth America on this. What we found in Connecticut and in upstate New York is that just as an example, 85% of districts with residential zoning have height limits. We have parking requirements are not really form-based. They relate to form-based codes, but they're not. But we have the height limits. We have FAR. We have we've seen, but we haven't logged things like roof shapes and things like that. But there are lots of communities out there that have what might pass for a form-based code if you kind of put a bunch of pieces together, but don't build themselves as a form-based code, aren't logged in the Smart Growth America's database of form-based codes. So I don't think there's an on-off switch where we say, well, this one's a form-based code and this one isn't. What we've been trying to do is to log the outcomes. So in a form-based code, you might have 30 feet height limit for building type A, 40-foot height limit for building type B. And then that's what we log in the spreadsheet, which is, you know, 30 feet building A, 40 feet building B. And so we're preserving that building type information, but we're doing it through the standardized, you know, form that we do it in. In some cases, we're guessing that certain building types are more prevalent. So for example, if we're you know, depending on the circumstances, we might say, well, 95% of things in this community are going to be covered by the 30-foot building height. Then we make a note of that, and we have a whole system of logging notes that then appear upon hover, and that's something that we're doing. But we're not clicking an on-off switch when we think something is a form-based code, because lots of places have form-based code type elements that, you know, we just don't have a good way to log.
Thank you. Lee, is ULI involved at all with the National Zoning Atlas?
Organization-wise, no. But personally, this hits very close to home. During COVID, I started my own little project of trying to catalog every single zoning and future land use map in the state of Florida. And let me tell you, it was an undertaking. And Sarah, when you say you cannot do it alone, you're 100% right. And so that's really where my interest in this came from. And I just thought that, you know, planners across the states could really benefit from knowledge about this initiative, and in addition to like some of the methodology behind it, because this regional collaboration question, in addition to the overarching implications of, you know, lack of collaboration on zoning, zoning maps, in addition to the existing zoning policies themselves, are, you know, it's a major issue, and it's something that I think, you know, a lot of people can benefit from. So that's where this is coming from. But ULI actually does do quite a bit of work in the zoning sphere. In fact, we are working on a report on emergent zoning policies for green buildings, resilience, and more broadly, like healthy places, building healthy places. So that report is actually going to be released towards the end of this year. I would keep an eye out for it. I'm very excited about it. In addition to quite a few other reports we've published on our Knowledge Finder platform, in addition to some publications that are free and open to the public. So happy to share those in the wake of this presentation as well.
Thank you. I think we're going to have time for just 2 more questions, and then I'll let Sarah off the hook here because we've been asking you a lot of questions and you're doing great. So have you, and I feel like we partially talked about this earlier in the Q&A, but what do we think the public facing user interface or user experience is going to look like?
It'll look something like the Connecticut Zoning Atlas experience, except that it will be, we're going to have more of the stats. So in Connecticut, we've displayed about 1/3 of the data points that we've collected. But when we build up the national product, we'll display more. So including things like minimum parking requirements, including things like building heights, and all of the other things that we've logged. So that it'll, I think, be similar in that the user can click on different things. And then one of the great features of the Connecticut Atlas, I think, is that when you click within a jurisdiction, it pops up with the stats for that jurisdiction based on what you selected. So if you clicked on Hartford, it would say, 40% is zoned for multifamily housing as of right. And when you click on it, or for example, so that I think is a really great tool because you can just click from one jurisdiction to another. That is definitely a tool that we want to preserve in the online map.
Great. Funny story. I literally just got an email from Sean Suter, who is spearheading through ZoneCo, the Ohio effort. Great. So I guess the final question is, and more.
What did he say? Did he say he needs help?
Yeah, he's like, we are slogging through 250 municipal zoning codes right now.
Yes, yep. So they're doing the cities, I guess the cities and towns, and then you guys have townships and villages, and
We've got a lot of townships. We got a lot of townships, and honestly, that's where it's going to get interesting, because at least in Ohio we have a large chunk of Appalachia that just doesn't have any zoning at all, and so it'll be kind of interesting to see where our trends are. It'll be really interesting. So so I guess the last question, or sort of bringing this all together, and I know you've mentioned this, so what can we as planners, what can we do right now? And I'm going to start off by trying my attempt at answering it, and that is look online and see if your state has started the process. Reach out to them to see how you can help, how you can participate, how you can submit data. And if your state hasn't, reach out to you guys. Once you kind of get a team together, reach out to you guys to help the project move along so that we can come to eventually a really great national atlas. What else, Sarah, do you have to say to all of us here on the line?
Yeah, well, I just am really grateful that so many people tuned in and got to learn a little bit more about it. It may seem daunting when you start reading through the how-to guide, but I promise you this is a fun project for the right. If your mind thinks like this and you're interested in just learning more about zoning, this is a really, really fun project. And so I encourage you to consider, as Christine was saying, to do your own project in your state. And most importantly, get your APA chapter involved. I think that this is a great project for professional planners to contribute and to create. It's really a crowdsourced public resource that relies on the people who are building it to have planning expertise. So this is, I think, a really great project for the planning community to be involved with. And so I look forward to hearing from folks about pitching in. And when we get that national project coordinator hired, please soon, we'll be doing more quarterly meetings and things like that. So we'll make this an even more official thing, because right now the only full-time person on this is me, and I actually am supposed to be, a professor and doing lots of other things too. So I love reinforcements. I'll be excited when this project coordinator comes on. So please share that job description, that link to jobs for somebody who's interested. And I think hopefully now that you've gotten the sense of the project, you can also figure out, okay, this kind of person would be great at this this job. So that's it from me.
Great. Thank you. Lee, what do you have? What do you have to say? Anything?
Really just some quick closing remarks and thanks to everyone. I guess with this, we're concluding this presentation, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your insights today. And thank you, Christine, so much for your fantastic coordination and fielding of questions. And of course, to everyone in attendance for your time and your engagement throughout the session. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to share my contact information if you have any follow-up questions about the APA Technology Division. Of course, any follow-up questions about UOI, in addition to any sort of like engagement activities you'd like to do with the division and again with UOI. So thank you again, and that's it from me.
Okay, I put a couple links in the chat box for everybody, including Lee's email if you're interested in more info on the technology division or anything related to that. Don't forget, we are recording this session. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to log your credits. We have an ethics session coming up this Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. And head over to our webcast website to register for all of our upcoming sessions and get all the information and of course links to recordings at ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So again, thanks to the technology division. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lee. Everyone, thank you to the puppy in the background. There were people asking questions about, yeah, your pup made a cameo in the, yeah. We want, actually, there were a couple questions. The people want to know what kind of dog it is because
Chip Telemachus Bronin is a Havanese.
Okay, all right. There were a couple of those questions. So, and to the munchkin in the background, we just saw she made a cameo too, it looks like. So thanks everyone for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. Have a great day and we'll talk next time. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.